I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming today. We're delighted that you joined us for the Lemelson Center's New Perspectives on Invention and Innovation Symposium. My name is Jeffrey Brody. I'm the Deputy Director of the Jerome and Dorothy Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation here at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Since 1995, the Lemelson Center has dedicated itself to the study of the role that invention and innovation play in the history of the United States. We do this through a variety of enterprises, which include our exhibitions and our research, collecting archival materials, our hands-on Spark Lab, our publications, and public programs just like this one. Our annual New Perspective Symposium is designed to bring together historians, inventors, practitioners, and a broad range of audiences to explore new avenues of inquiry into the history of invention and innovation. This year we are exploring Food for Tomorrow, and the symposium sessions and other program activities explore the ways in which we produce, prepare, and consume food, yesterday, today, and in the future. You will find a full description and schedule of the sessions and other activities in your program. And our event today is a collaboration between the Lemelson Center and the National Museum of American History's Food and Wine Project. Together, we share a keen interest in the role of invention and innovation play in what we eat and how we eat it. And today's program is certainly richer and it's sweeter as a product of our work together. And on behalf of the Lemelson Center and the Food and Wine Group, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of the Smithsonian Associates and our other many colleagues in the Museum of American History for their contributions to this effort. Today, we have a distinguished group of scholars, inventors, and practitioners who have come from far and wide to graciously share their expertise with us today. To our keynote speaker, Warren Belasco, and our other symposium participants, I thank you for leading us on what I'm sure will be a very joyful and interesting journey today. So at this time, I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Warren Belasco, Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Warren is highly regarded as a founder of the academic food studies movement and has been working in the field for more than 25 years. Many of his works and writings have become scholarly standards, and among these are Americans on the Road, Appetite for Change, Meals to Come, and Food, the Key Concepts, which is a required text for food study courses at a number of universities. Currently, Professor Belasco's research focus centers on the culinary history of Washington, D.C., where he lives and grows figs. From scholar to practitioner. So we're really fortunate to have Warren here today to provide us with an introduction for our inquiries and to discuss the question, what might be on our tables in the year 2050 and beyond. So please help join me in welcoming Professor Belasco to the podium.
I love being a founder. That's great. And I do require the text in my own courses, at least. So I'm starting off. The future of food is going to be mushy. That's I think how it was conceived for a very long time. One of the undercurrents I've noticed in doing a lot of research on the future is that it was assumed that people either would have no teeth in the future or would not want to use them, maybe because they're protecting their delicate crown work and so forth. But and I think that's the meaning of the book cover that I have here. But actually, now that I've got you sort of warmed up, my opening comments are really a lot more severe, I suppose. The way I approach the question of the future of food is: are we going to starve, and how will we provide enough food for future generations? That's what I've been worrying about for some time, I guess, like a lot of people. And my starting point is a book. I think if you had one book to read on the future of food, it would be Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, or as the subtitle in that wonderful old British style, an essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on the speculations of Mr. Godwin, Monsieur Condorcet, and other writers. And it's a wonderful book to open up various scenarios about where we might be going. And the wonderful thing about being an academic is you can lay out the scenarios and not ever choose one. You just say, well, these are the different, on the one hand, on the other hand, and there are actually three hands in this particular debate. And what I've noticed looking back over what people have said about the future is really three positions. One starting with Malthus, basically that there's just not going to be enough food in the future. Too many people, we like sex too much, and agriculture can't keep up. So really the solution to that is either we have to cut back on cut back on sex, which Malthus did not believe was possible or moral, or you let nature do it, which might be called the natural fix through famine and hunger and disease and so forth. And Joel Cohen, the great demographer, has characterized this position as the fewer forks at the table position for the future. And I'm going to sketch out each of these three positions in a minute, but first let me just give you the summary of them. Now, his main debating partner in his book, the principle on the essay on population, was the Monsieur Marquis de Condorcet, the great French philosopher and Enlightenment thinker and mathematician, who basically argued the cornucopian position that no, we can, but through technology and through wise business practices, we can always bake bigger pies. We can always produce more food for more people. And that might be called the technological fix. And then there's the third position, sort of the odd man out in the debate, but was mentioned in the title page and quite significant. And that's William Godwin, the British radical socialist anarchist egalitarian argument. No, if we just behave better and share our food and redistribute it perhaps better and not be so greedy, if we have better manners, you might say, we will have more than enough food to serve our future needs. And this might be called the anthropological fix, meaning we have to kind of remake humans to be better people. And as you'll see, it's a rather idealistic position. So now I want to go through into those three very quickly. The Malthusian future, characterized by overpopulation, famine, or the natural fix, and for those of us who haven't died off in the natural fix, pretty bad food, represented here by images of Ireland and Africa as the kind of worst cases that we may face us all in the future if we keep going in population growth. The Malthusian argument is full of wake-up calls, and again, examples from history, as are all these, all three positions, and which is one of the ironies of when you're talking about the future, really talking about the past and what people have said in the past. And in terms of wake-up calls, in the Malthusian arguments, you'll always hear about China on the upper left-hand corner, and then India, and then Ireland as the European worst case. In a more neo-Malthusian argument, the more modernist environmental version of it, the talk is often in terms of carrying capacity, that there just has to be a limit to how much this earth can carry, and at some point it's just going to get worn out and tired, as represented in these two graphics. For those who survive the culling through famine and disease, we're left with some pretty poor food choices in the Malthusian future. A lot of the Malthusian future was framed in terms of Asia, that's the direction we're going to be going, and that wasn't a good thing from a British point of view, which of course Malthus represented, or Anglo-American view either. So rice, really the centerpiece of the future of food in the Malthusian diet, and that was, again, not something to be embraced. Or perhaps kelp and seaweed, as the Koreans and East Asians were pretty good at, converting that kind of discarded, and indeed the Irish and the Scottish too, when they faced Malthusian conditions, also turned to kelp as a high-protein, high-fat food, but generally considered rather disgusting to the middle-class British appetite of Malthus's day. Or perhaps through the wonders of science, we might be turning sawdust into food, but in this context, not considered a very happy future. The Malthusian future is well embedded in science fiction. It really films very well, and that sort of Armageddon, break all against all sort of scenario has been played out in quite a number of scientific films and science fiction. literature as well, and probably the most popular one and the most influential one was Soylent Green, based in part on the works of Paul Ehrlich, the Malthusian entomologist from Stanford. And Soylent Green certainly made its impact on my generation, a world of 2022, and we were left to eating, well, chlorella algae, in other words, kelp, or eating each other as recycled remainders. Now, a more recent version of the Malthusian future as a threat is Asia, but Asia revised not so much as a basket case of poverty and famine, but Asia as a place of prosperity and a lot of people eating McDonald's. And how on earth, as Lester Brown asked 15 years ago, who will feed China if everybody wants a hamburger or even an egg? And that picture on the upper left-hand corner from Hungry Planet showing a week's worth of groceries in a middle-class Shanghai family kind of makes one think, well, how can the world meet that kind of demand? So it's not so much the starving Asians that'll eat us out of home as the successful, striving Asians. And then a sort of a more recent version of the Malthusian threat was the question of, well, maybe it won't be people who will eat us out of house and home, but our cars, as we feed corn to cars, and maybe that will drive up food prices and lead towards a Malthusian sort of future. Now, the happy alternative, and perhaps the default position in this argument, the one I think we all like to come home to, is the cornucopian future. And I noticed, the more I look at that word, the word corn does emerge there. And those of you who were here for the film yesterday by the Corn Guys, King Corn Guys, really show that quite graphically, as does Michael Pollan in Omnivore's Dilemma. The corn is really the basis of the modern high-tech food system that we live in. But if we go back to this, even before we start to grow a lot of corn, the faith was that we could, through technology, bake bigger pies or better meals for less, as that picture on the left. And I have that graphic of John McCain from the 2000 long ago campaign, 2008. But I think you could probably put Barack Obama in that picture too. I think any politician who wants to get elected in America has to take the cornucopian position. A couple of variants of the cornucopian position. The classic version was just if you ran out of food, you took somebody else's, and through territorial expansion, you found more land to grow more food for you, and run more animals to give you more meat. So that's kind of the go west strategy in America. One gains abundance through expanding your agricultural cultivation, and also through very aggressive sea trade to make sure that you have the most favorable market conditions, and also just a flag-waving America first sort of nationalism. And that carried us through most of the 19th century, and this graphic is from the mid-19th century of the kind of cornucopian American future. It's the world of the cattle empire, the endless expansion of moving west and south, or in some cases north, to find more land, to grow more cattle. And it's the John Wayne Red River future being fought for in the 19th century. But it comes right out of the British policy of expanding into Scotland and Ireland also to run more cattle, often at the expense of the Scots and the Irish. And the image on the right is from the Albert Memorial in London, and I just noticed, I think that's either Britannia or Queen Victoria, I'm not quite sure, but the big cow right on her right-hand shoulder there, I think is symbolic of British imperial policy in the Americas, and ours as well. But then there's always the question, what happens when you run out of land? And this is an issue that was raised by Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893, but it's one that's always been haunting the cornucopians. What happens if there's just not enough land to feed the future? Well, then we have truly the technological fix, or the modernist future of streamlining and reductionism and synthetics and efficiency and consolidation Fordism and all these ingredients of modern food production. And that's basically the road we have taken. We took it in the 19th century, and this picture from 1902, I think, expresses industrial farming and grain farming at its latest at that time. In the 1920s, the science fiction version of the industrial farming, I think, wasn't all that far off from what was actually happening. These giant tractors knocking down small towns and factories and turning them into farmland to grow more grain more efficiently. And other versions of it, the California vegetable production went there in the 1920s, and then industrial animal farms in the post-World War II era. So we've been living this cornucopian future. This is what's fed us, if not well, at least abundantly. And then I just want to show you a few sort of extrapolations of that in the world of more speculative fiction and speculative forecasting. This graphic from National Geographic in 1970, looking at the farm of the future, where everything is really consolidated in place. You grow it, it's harvested, it's processed, and it's shipped all in one location off to the city. And it's not that far away from what's actually happening. Some of the more far-out versions of the technological fix is, well, maybe we can take land that was not ever that you couldn't cultivate and turn it into farms through the kind of desert farming. What I like about this picture most is the lack of any people in it. It's the automated version of it. Push-button farming, I think, is part of this vision of the cornucopian farm. Or maybe going off Earth altogether into outer space. That was a very popular scenario, particularly driving to some extent the space program was, well, not only to beat the Russians, but maybe in case the Malthusians are right and we need to grow land on Mars, or food on Mars or on the moon. There were people ready to imagine that. Or why not melt the Arctic ice caps with radio waves, as this picture from 1939 illustrates. And we are doing that. Maybe not intentionally, but this is, in a sense, reality is following fantasy. What's interesting about the modernist future is that it really was very embedded in people's homes as well, and I think it really took a hold, particularly in the mid 20th century, and particularly in the Great World's Fairs of the 1930s and 1964. Really brought the modernist future right into the kitchen, and this picture from the 1939 World's Fair of the kitchen of the future was a very popular exhibit. And what I find glass and steel and very streamlined and looks very efficient. I call it a kitchen lab. It's cooking as science at its highest degree. There's no food there, though. Food is almost irrelevant in the modernist future. It's more the process that's so interesting. This picture from 1955 of a 1965 kitchen of the not so far away future. You could meditate on this graphic for quite a long time. This is kind of Jetson's world. It's also sort of assembly line incorporated into the kitchen in the sense of this sort of movable nonstop processing of food, push button. Everything is also very triangular. There's you can write a dissertation about the triangular dresses that these women are wearing. And then push button also in terms of computers. And of course, Jane Jetson was a computer cook in her own, using cards, the early versions of computer technology. But you just order it up, press a few buttons, and there it is. What's interesting about this one on the left, the Honeywell picture, is that it says in small letters, if only she can cook as well as Honeywell can compute. It's really assumed the cook is really dumb and an idiot, but technology is the future. And we see versions of the push button in retailing in a variety of forms, including such, the automat, in a sense, was an early attempt at this kind of futurism from the very early part of the 1900s. Or 2001's commissary, where they pushed a few buttons and got some mush out of it. That was the food of space travel. It was mushy beans and beef turned into puree and algae. But in a good way, tasty algae, not yucky algae like the Malthusians would say. The retailing also followed up into the modernist vision and really embedded it in the streamlining of stores and the air conditioning and the lighting and the whole modern style of the post-World War II supermarket. And then on the far fringes of modernism were those who were arguing, I don't know if that's my foot, just to wake you up. In the far fringes were those who said, well, we could synthesize food in the future, and why not? It would save a lot of time and effort and struggle and land. It's also efficient and rational and probably nutritious as well. Even in the 1930s, people were talking about the meal. Well, the meal in the pill goes back to the Victorian era. It was more or less a feminist vision of saving us from the kitchen. And in the film, Just Imagine in 1930, I think, expresses that it's a modernist future where you push a button and you get a meal. The guy's about to eat a roast beef dinner, which he then eats, and he says, it's a little tough. And then you can push a button and get a baby as well. Everything is push button. The whole reproductive system is push button. And then NASA, of course, did follow up on, at least not, if not the meal in the pill, the meal in a tube, and that beef and vegetable dinner, which was the astronauts were subjected to, is sort of the finest expression of modernist cuisine. And needless to say, the astronauts lost a lot of weight when they went to space because they wouldn't eat the stuff. And there was inevitably a reaction to modernism. It started in there are periods of modernism, even anti-modernism, even in the early 19th century with books like Frankenstein by Godwin's daughter, Mary Shelley. But in the 1960s, there was a whole-scale reaction against modernism, and that's what these graphics express. And you see a lot of that critique of modernism being carried out even to this day in the whole war about genetically modified foods, arguing that it's either a version of neo-imperialism, a big grab by big companies, and the major Western countries, such as in the book Stolen Harvest by Vandana Shiva, or it's also a sort of, in the Shelley version, scary modernism, foods that are going to run away and contaminate the food supply and poison us and turn us into automatons ourselves, Farmageddon, Frankenfoods. And that version, you can see both of those in these two anti-Monsanto graphics. No food shall be grown that we don't own, being the motto of the pseudo-Monsanto. And then in the French, the version of I'm making the world over in my own image, of the Frankenfoods image of genetically modified foods. So then there's the third position. Where do we go if we don't want modernism and we can't stand the Malthusian future? Well, maybe we can just make ourselves better people and better mannered, better behaved. We can redistribute the food and decentralize it and give women more power, particularly in the third world where a lot of the food is grown by women. We can be more cooperative and maybe cut back a little bit and also be a little slower in the way we conduct our lives and therefore less reliant on convenience and processed foods. And I use the image of the French Revolution to sort of give the outer limits of the Godwinian position, but it is somewhat of a socialist position. I say that this week with great advisory being here in the middle of Washington, D.C. But there's a long tradition of utopian thought that Godwin himself, William Morris, many 19th century Victorian utopian writers and indeed utopian communities tried to practice this scaling back, sharing, redistributing, going back to nature sort of future. In the 60s, brought it back with a vengeance with a lot of utopian novels and indeed utopian communities, such as the farm in Tennessee on the bottom picture there. The more individualistic version of this future is the agrarian, the small farmer, the yeoman Jeffersonian farmer, also brought back and revived. And this is perhaps even more popular within American culture and really spans the left and right. We have people on the very far left, like the Nearings, going back to the land and trying to live the simple life and get out of the modern capitalist world. And then there are the people on the right wing, like Joel Salatin, also expressing these kinds of highly individualistic agrarian values. Stephen Gaskin, the guru at the farm in the 1970s, also I think expressed what might be called what became the slow food philosophy. That if we can just figure out a ways to slow our lives down a bit and pay more attention to what we're doing and enjoy food more in a more concentrated way, in a more deliberate way, we can get rid of a lot of the baggage of modern life and live with less and enjoy more. And that might be a way to help spread it around. And I think this little poem that he wrote, How to Slow Down, it was a meditation, you know, find a little bit of land somewhere, plant a carrot seed, now watch and sit it grow. When it's fully grown, pull it up and eat it. It's almost child's world, but that's almost the point, in a sense, a kind of meditative regression. And I put the slow food snail there on the right just to show that they're coming out of that tradition, I think. And Alice Waters has voiced this philosophy of the future in her Delicious Revolution. If we just have really good food and not a whole lot of it, we'll enjoy it better and it'll go farther and we'll do less damage along the way. Another component of this egalitarian vision is decentralizing the food production, bringing producers and consumers closer, and you probably hear more of that later on today. The 100-mile diet and the whole buy local campaign. Really, in some ways, reviving some of the mentality that came out of World War I and II in so many of the conservationist and grow your own campaigns of those two eras. And these are pictures from both wars, showing that the whole notion of growing your own and saving food that way and saving energy is pretty well entrenched, at least in our military history. And also the notion here, the asceticism, you know, eating less, eating lower down on the food chain, not wasting food, also well embedded in wartime conservation drives. But I want to just end up by and of course that's where my heart is in terms of the future. I wrote a book called Appetite for Change, really. It's about people who had that vision. But my head is somewhere else. And maybe it comes from living in Washington too long and inside the Beltway, and seeing the best utopian intentions going, you know, into the dirt, quite literally, and breaking apart. And I wanted to just identify a couple of problems with the egalitarian future, or at least obstacles to going that way, because we do see, as we saw in the film last night, quite a lot of sentiment for people wanting to bring this mentality to the fore again, and there's an amazing amount of ingenuity going into it. But I think the biggest enemy is probably, would identify it as the USDA across the mall over there, but I'm not so sure anymore. I think the biggest enemy is ridicule, that our culture has amazing ways of bringing reformers under, you know, making fun of them and marginalizing them. And here are a couple of cartoons that express that sort of view of the countercultural foodways. In sudden disgust, the three lionesses realized they had killed a tafudi beast, one of the Serengeti's obnoxious health antelopes. Or the one on the right actually really does, I think, get at the sense of, you know, can we really deal with going back? You know, progress, particularly progress through technology and invention, is so much a part of our culture. And, you know, our ancestors clawed their way to the top of the food chain for this, a house of soy all the time. Is that really where we're going? Is that a future we want to aspire to? It's a good question, I think. And there are numerous ways to, of course, ridicule food reformers, the food police, the nannies, the elitists, making fun of poor old arugula, which I think is one of the great wonder foods of all time, and it grows everywhere. It's a weed, and yet it was made into an elitist Whole Foods kind of icon. When all else fails, you can talk about Hitler. I call this the reductio ad Hitlerium. Hitler, if you want to just end the conversation and put people down, bring up Hitler. And then in a more serious way, there is the problem of capitalism lurking in the background, and when they adopt elements of reform foods and food ways, what happens? Do we get a Whole Foods kind of future where the scaling up of the Victory Garden becomes a huge food chain? Or even worse, what happens? What do we make of Walmart when it becomes the world's largest organic producer, retailer, and indeed now local food as well? Those are kinds of questions about co-optation that we have to worry about. And then I have a couple of cautionary questions about this future. You know, do we really want to go back to the land? And I use this graphic, which I found on the web. I just love this one, the American Scream print, putting together Edvard Munch's painting with Grant Wood's. And what I notice about this most is the woman is the one who's hysterical, and that almost applies to farm life as we know it in the past. But also, I noticed the farmer looks an awful lot like Michael Pollan, and I don't know whether who adopted what style there. And another question is, a lot of the premise of going back is that the food was better. And I'm not sure as a historian that's always true. I'm not sure that Grandma really was a better cook. My grandmother was, but she also loved Jell-O. And a lot of grandmas were on the phone ordering up Jell-O in 1910. You know, Grandma was a modernist long ago, and often for good reasons, to get out of the kitchen. And a lot of grandmas burnt dinner as well, as that pot on the bottom suggests. And then finally, the big question is, you know, do we really want a life that's not as convenient in the future? Convenience is what drives the food industry, taking the labor out of it for us. And if you are what you eat, then I'm fast, cheap, and easy. My students look at this and say, yeah, that's us. I'm happy with that. And then finally, the final question is the first question, which is, and this is my last one, is while we're kind of laughing about all this marketing and growing, you know, food in windows and all that wonderful ingenuity that's being done in our world, what about the rest of the world, and who is going to feed the future? And I see in many ways the future of food is really defined by the two extremes of Chad and China in many ways, and what do we do about them, and who's going to provide either to feed to the billion people who don't get an adequate food, or the other several billion who want to eat like we do coming up in Asia. What do we do about that? I'm not sure those are easy questions to answer, and I hope to hear more about that today. So I'm done. Somebody supposed to take a question or two, or do we need to move on? Right on. Quick question, yeah.
So I know you're talking about World's Fairs. Are you aware that in 2015 you're going to have World's Fair in Milan, Italy, and the theme is Feeding the World Energy for Life. And the entire theme of the expo is food, agriculture, energy, and hospitality. So,
thanks for the plug. I'm going to have to go to update my book. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you think is the largest world population level that can exist
Well, that's a question that Joel Cohen, who I mentioned, and how many people can the Earth support, or so, something, his title is something like that. He asked that question, and he alludes it by saying, really, it depends on at what level, standard of living do we want to live at. Do we want to, if we want to live at the level of Chad, we can probably support 20 billion people. If we want to live at the standard of Washington, of Bethesda, Washington, maybe a couple million, or maybe a couple billion if we stretch. So it really, it's a question of at what standard of living do we want to live, and so I don't think there is a single question on that. But people have certainly tried. There's a whole range of estimates, from a few hundred million to tens of billions. I'm not sure there's no way of knowing that without talking about values.
Yeah. Oh, one of the features recently on NPR brought out the fact that almost half the food produced in this country is thrown away. They pointed out at the producer, if the lettuce isn't perfect, it's thrown out. In the supermarkets, whatever isn't bought in a few days is thrown out. And in the restaurant buffets, whatever isn't consumed at the end of the day is thrown out.
And I think that brings out a big, and this is one that at least the redistributionists were arguing that there's enough food out there. It's not so much production, but it's how you use it, and wise and reuse and conservationist techniques may be a way to wring more food out than we realize. Yeah, I'm going to move on. Okay.